And some of our first national parks were set aside just for their scenic value. But the Big Thicket was set aside because it had this botanical diversity. And sometimes it looks very ordinary. We get a lot of visitors from other countries, and when they see it, they get pretty excited about it because they recognize it as being really unique. But if you were born and raised here and you had seen it all of your life, you wouldn't recognize it as being anything out of the ordinary. So we kind of struggle with that. If you were to probably ask the average person to describe the Big Thicket, they would probably describe something like this. Lots of vines, dark, foreboding, swampy, kind of a place. I think it's partly bound up in the name. Even the name Big Thicket sounds like that. And then when you trace the cultural history back, you find out that it was a hideout for outlaws and people that were fleeing from their past or from poverty. And that adds to the mystique. That even makes it sound like more of a mysterious, dangerous kind of a place. You have to get past that. We have kind of a difficult park to present. We have to spend a lot of time explaining why it's a national treasure. Because it doesn't leap out at you, it doesn't just grab you by the heart and command your attention. It's the kind of park where you kind of need to get close to it. You need to spend a little bit of time recognizing the communities. And in order to do that, you have to be able to recognize some of the plants. Franklin Lake is a swamp forest community. We can classify these bottomland areas into swamp forest communities and floodplain forest communities. The difference being that swamp forest communities are inundated most of the year, and floodplain forest may be inundated only part of the time. That seems like a small difference, but from the standpoint of the vegetation, it's a large difference. You'll notice in here, most of the vegetation is cypress and tupelo, and not too much else. The prominence of the palmetto really gives this community its character. And it's in these flats that you find this palmetto forest. And interestingly enough, it's probably this little community that most often people identify with the Big Thicket. It seems to fit the stereotype of the big woods, the jungle-like habitat. With a little experience, you realize that the Big Thicket is much more diverse than that, and it's not fair to characterize it in terms of just one of the communities. I see myself as being kind of like a matchmaker. My job is to help people fall in love with the Big Thicket. The easiest way to identify it is to look for the little insect gall. The general rule of thumb is never eat white berries. I need to find a really good post oak. These are not real nice. You have that mingling and blending of the east and the west in these unusual combinations of ordinary things. It has to be an upside down flower to work. Really neat. delineate. I remember my first impression of the Kirby Nature Trail. My first impression that it was a very dark and foreboding place. So much different from the open western lands that I knew growing up. So closed in. It took me a while to get used to that. It's a biological crossroads. In the National Park Service, we like to say that Turkey Creek, really high water, but the purpose of interpretation is protection, because what you interpret for someone they understand, and what people understand they appreciate, and what people appreciate they protect. But there's no geology around here. If you look around, you won't find rocks. You can go all day and not find rocks. And you have to think, what's going on here? How come we don't have rocks? We just have sand and silt and clay. Well, it goes back to the geological history of this area. And our best understanding of it is that these soils were deposited by numerous rivers that appeared in the wake of the retreating glaciers. There were 4 glacial advances, and when you look at the soil terraces of the Gulf Coast, there are 4 levels. And each glacier advance was smaller than the previous one. So the terraces were further and further inland when they dropped their sediments. Sands and silts and clays all mixed together. All of the communities in the Big Thicket are shaped by the interaction between soil and water. We get a lot of rain, 55 inches on the average a year. And the way that rain interacts with the soil is going to determine what kind of community you get. Well, the Savannah is one of the stranger communities in the Big Thicket. A savanna is a saucer-shaped community. It's not at the bottom of a hill. It may even be on high ground. And we don't exactly understand how these depressions were formed, but they're here. And they collect and hold rainwater. The savanna is a stressed community. When it's wet, it's too wet. And when it's dry, it's too dry because the groundwater underneath can't get up to the roots. So you've got plants here that are either in standing water or it's too dry. We see a lot of vegetation, but look at it. It's not heavy wood. It's herbaceous stuff. You get ground covers and a lot of grasses and sedges and rushes. And this is our wildflower community. And the reason is because that water is constantly taking all the food value in the soil and it's filtering it out. Just takes it out of the soil. So we have a nutrient-deficient soil. The carnivorous plants have an edge. They can use insect protein to supplement their diet. It's seamed all the way up here, and all along that seam there are glands. And then around this lip, it's called the nectar roll. And there are nectar glands that are just concentrated on the seam and on that nectar roll. That attracts the insect to the plant. It smells good. You might think, what smells good to you? Chocolate or beefsteak or whatever. Imagine that the pitcher plant smells that good to an insect. probably thinks he's dealing with a flower. It smells good, it's got nectar guides, kind of looks like a flower, doesn't look like a leaf. This modified leaf has some zones in it. There's a zone down about this far that's very smooth. There's nothing in there like a tile floor. But you get down in this zone here, and it's carpeted. They're hairs. They're very fine hairs. And they all point down, straight down. If the insect gets down into that zone, it'll start to constrict. When it gets too tight, the insect will turn around and try to come back up. But when it does, it's going against the grain of those hairs, and it'll finally give up the fight. And when it does, it'll fall, and it'll fall into a fluid. That fluid is not rainwater, because this little cap keeps the rainwater out, that umbrella. It's enzyme. It's a digestive stomach enzyme. And it will dissolve all but the hard body parts. It'll become a part of the pitcher plant, and the hard body parts will remain behind. That's a graveyard. Victims. The early Big Thicket folks called the Big Thicket the tie-tie thickets, or they actually corrupted it to tight-eye. It's really T-I-T-I, tie-tie, but it was such dense vegetation that you had to get down on your hands and knees and crawl through it, so they call it the tight-eye thickets. They used to say that the Big Thicket was so thick that a snake would have to crawl out backwards. We don't have a lot of evidence of Indian occupation of the Big Thicket in the narrowest sense of the term. A lot of foraging and hunting parties and those kind of things, but not large settlements. There were in the outlying areas of the Big Thicket. The first really commercial attraction to the Big Thicket was the timber. It was an enormous area. If you can imagine 3 million acres of trees that just seemed to go on forever. And in the beginning, timber harvesting was very slow. The pine trees that we've been looking at, they can live 150 years max. The Big Thicket oak trees, 500 years. But cypress trees, they can have 1,000 birthdays. It's incredible. The cypress trees that we're looking at are youngsters. When the first settlers came into the Big Thicket, just consider that they were seeing cypress trees that were 1,000 years old. Those trees were so big that they were taller laying down after they had been cut down than a man standing up. Enormous, gigantic trees. It's an incredible thing to picture. It would take a whole day just to take one tree out of the Big Thicket by ox cart. Tough job, tough job. But with the ability to harvest trees by train, the little trams, the harvesting of the Big Thicket timber was greatly accelerated. They could run those trams off through the woods and harvest a block of land, pick the tracks up, move them over, and harvest another block. So now we weren't cutting trees, we were cutting tracks. Our best understanding from pollen samples and various kinds of studies is that the longleaf pine was the original dominant pine tree for the Big Thicket. The longleaf pine is an incredible timber species. It has a clear bowl, a knot-free wood, very high-quality timber. It's probably mistaken for a clump of grass, but it's a tree in the formative stages. The early needles protect a terminal bud right in the middle of that little cluster. And that's a very important relationship because those needles, which will become 12 inches long, protect the longleaf pine from fire. I've seen them burn down to just the nubbins and still come back. The other pines, like the loblolly pine, the slash, and the shortleaf pine, can't respond from fire like that. They don't have the protection of those long needles. There's another interesting thing here. The longleaf is subject to a disease when it's in this grass stage. It's a rust that attacks the needles. And the rust has one enemy, and that's fire. The fire will come and it'll kill the rust, but it won't kill the tree. But then eventually it'll take off and it'll just really shoot up. It'll become real spindly. And then when they start sending out branches, they begin to look like a candelabra. When we began to harvest it, we also began suppressing fire. When we began fighting fires, we began to favor that faster growing loblolly pine. And they began to overshadow and shade the slow growing longleaf and began to dominate. And so the forest canopy changed very gradually from longleaf pine to loblolly. And then down through the years, as timbering became more and more demanding and more sophisticated, they found that they could shorten the cutting cycle by importing slash pine trees from Florida to replace the loblolly. So the forest canopy changed one more time. It changed from longleaf to loblolly to shortleaf. And at this point, we have the challenge of trying to turn back the clock. And to do that, we have to restore the original conditions that favored the longleaf pine, and that means fire. In the Big Thicket, we have park rangers that not only suppress fires, but they start them. We were losing what was normal. And I feel that we really acted at the 11th hour. It's too bad we didn't act a little bit sooner. But 1974 is when it all came together, October 1974. Knowing what we know about southeast Texas now, here we've got the mosquitoes all around us, and it's humid and muggy. Can you imagine this being a glacial front? When I first came here and I read about the Savannah, one of the scientists said that it was one of our wettest habitats, and it is. And it's our most flammable. And I thought, well, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't compute. But it really is. Because the things that grow in here are your light, airy fuels. And you get these real tall longleaf pines out here, these lightning rods. And you get these storms that move through the Savannah. And they'll come down and ignite the Savannah and torch it. The soil around the edge of the Bagel is going to be acidic because of that tannin. The water falls on the slope, it runs down on top of the leaf litter, and it dissolves the tannin in the pine needles and in the oak leaves. and it settles out at the bottom of the hill. So that's where you're going to find your bagel. It's going to be at the bottom of a slope forest community. And you think, well, that must be fabulous soil with all of that organic matter in there. But it's terrible. It's terrible soil. Because that organic matter just falls there and it doesn't decompose, it doesn't break down. You think, well, I wonder why not? Because the acid, it's pickled. It's pickled. It's just preserved. But there's something real interesting. You know, we were talking about being far away from home, separated from family. That happens naturally in the life of the cypress tree because that woody cone falls from the tree, and because the parent is in standing water, the cone doesn't have a chance to grow close to mom and dad. It's going to float away to the next high ground, and it will germinate far away from mom and dad. It can grow in standing water, but it can't germinate in standing water. It's got to germinate on dirt. Here we're on a sand hill. You don't have water collecting at all. The water just soaks right through it, drains right out. So even though it's in a wet part of the country, it's still dry. So we're going to see some post oak, we're going to see some cactus, strange things. They seem to be out of place, but it's their niche. It's the only place where they can find growing conditions that are right. Plants that you're going to find growing up here are going to be the plants that can do well in the arid southwest. When the insect visits the pitcher plant, and that's hard to understand, how can you have a plant that captures insects for a living? It kills them. And yet it depends on them for pollination. It's one of those philosophical questions that's fun to debate. This stuff is, interestingly enough, a member of the pineapple family. And it has a very finely divided leaf. It doesn't even look like it's alive because the leaf is gray in color and not green, but it is alive. It takes its nutrients from the air. It's an epiphyte. It's not attached to the ground in any way. It doesn't take any nutrients from the tree. It absorbs its nutrients from the air. Plants that are sensitive to either air quality or water quality are called indicator plants. They indicate the health of the environment to us. And we need to pay attention to these kind of plants. They're telling us about our world, what kind of condition it's in, what's happening. I think the vistas in the Big Thicket are micro-vistas. They're the little tiny things. Those little things that if you get down really close, you see something exciting, but they're not the grand scale. For the most part, they're not the grand scale kind of vistas that a lot of times we get attracted to. I think that's part of the magic of the Big Thicket, is being able to focus in on little things and having an inquisitive mind. Why is the lichen on that tie red? It's a plant. Don't plants have to be green? You know, if you can learn to do that, those little woodpecker holes we saw today. If you wonder about that and you search it out, it's kind of a neat story.